The lights were too bright. Even for a man who had stood behind 3 presidents and lectured at Harvard for decades, the studio light seemed like a different kind of spotlight, a judgmental one. The audience was a sea of grinning strangers, applauding out of routine rather than reverence. The music played its standard late-night jazz riff, but there was nothing casual about the energy on stage tonight. Robert Reich adjusted his tie as he stepped out from behind the curtain. The applause swelled, polite but measured, like they weren't quite sure what to expect from him. He gave the host, Stephen Carr, a nod of recognition, not the warm kind, but the kind you give an old rival you've learned to coexist with. Robert Reich, Stephen said, beaming in that manufactured way only late-night hosts could master. The man, the myth, the progressive legend. 19 books, 3 administrations, and somehow, still not retired. The audience laughed. Reich smiled, but his eyes stayed sharp. "It's good to be back, Stephen," he said as he took his seat. "It's been, what, 15 years? 15 years, Stephen echoed. "You haven't changed. Not even your haircut." Robert tilted his head. "Neither have you." Still interrupting before the second sentence. The audience laughed again, but this time, with an edge. They felt the undercurrent. This wasn't going to be a puff-piece nostalgia tour. Stephen leaned forward, index finger tapping the desk, clearly eager to control the narrative. "You know, last time you were here, you said something that stuck with me. You talked about economic inequality, and you said, quote, 'We either reform or we face a backlash.'" Robert's expression didn't flinch, but something in his jaw tightened. "And I remember thinking," Stephen continued, "God, I hope you're wrong. Because reform sounded hard and backlash sounded ugly. Well, it's 2025. Guess which door we opened?" A pause. The tension cut through the stage like a wire. Robert cleared his throat, speaking slowly, deliberately. "We opened the wrong door because the people with the keys were more concerned with power than justice. And now the house is burning." There was no applause. Only silence. Even the band behind the curtain went still. "And how do we stop the fire?" Stephen asked, tone suddenly serious. "Because it's one thing to say we need democracy. But what does that even mean when people can't afford rent, don't trust elections, and are watching billionaires buy up everything from farmland to senators?" Robert didn't blink. "It means we start by cutting off the fuel. Big money. Lobbyists. Super PACs. If we don't get corporate interests out of Washington, we don't have a government, we have a market with a military." The audience stirred. A few clapped. A few jeered. Someone shouted, "Socialist," from the back, only half joking. Stephen raised an eyebrow. "You're not pulling any punches tonight." "I've never had time for punches, Stephen," Robert replied. "Only truth." That line hit. It rippled through the crowd like a stone dropped in a still pond. "All right then," Stephen said, adjusting his cards, though his hands suddenly seemed a little less steady. "Let's talk truth. On Friday, the administration fired a senior official from the Bureau of Labor Statistics after unfavorable job numbers were released. You know that bureau intimately." "Yes," Robert said. "I do. What does that tell you?" "That the numbers weren't the problem," he said. "The truth was." And then, he leaned in, his voice dropping just enough to feel dangerous. "We're no longer debating policies. We're debating reality. And when reality becomes inconvenient for power, power erases it." The studio fell quiet again. Stephen exhaled through his nose. "You really think it's that bad?" "I think we're past denial, Stephen. I think we're at the stage where the liar isn't even trying to sound honest." Another ripple through the audience. But now Stephen's face was changing. Less playful. More defensive. "Let me play devil's advocate," he said. "Isn't that a little dramatic? Presidents have always clashed with data, with the press. This isn't new." Robert turned to him fully. "It's not the same. You know it. Firing a data official for doing his job isn't policy, it's propaganda. It tells every other civil servant, deliver the message we want, or you're next." Stephen shifted in his chair. "Robert," he said, now more cautiously, "you've been accused of alarmism before. Of painting worst-case scenarios as inevitabilities. What makes this different?" "Because this time, Stephen," Robert paused. "We're out of road. We've been kicking the can toward the edge of a cliff. Now we're midair." Stephen tried to cut in, but Robert didn't let him. "You know what's most dangerous about authoritarianism?" he asked the room. "It's not the violence. Not the corruption. It's the normalization. When you watch something awful happen, fire the statistician, lie about the budget, threaten the press, and instead of rage, you feel tired. Instead of marching, you scroll. That's when they win. When silence becomes habit." A woman in the front row wiped a tear. Another man clapped. The room was tilting, mood shifting. Stephen narrowed his eyes, trying to pull the show back on track. Okay, he said. But what about optimism? You've always been one of the most hopeful public servants out there. What gives you hope now? Robert softened, just slightly. Young people, he said. They see through the bullshit faster than we did. They know what's broken. And they're not waiting for permission to fix it. There was real applause now. Genuine. A spark of something beginning to catch fire. And what would you say to them? Stephen asked. Robert looked straight at the camera. Stay loud, he said. Stay smart. Stay awake. And then, without missing a beat, and for those of you watching who aren't paying attention yet, subscribe. Not to me. Not even to this show. Subscribe to awareness. Subscribe to voices that challenge you. That push you. That make you uncomfortable. Because comfort got us here. Stephen chuckled awkwardly. That's a new kind of plug. Robert didn't smile. It's the only kind that matters. The band played a cue, signaling a break. Stephen shuffled his cards again, but this time with a slight tremor. We'll be right back, he said, trying to keep the energy up. Stick around. More with Robert Reich after this. The lights dimmed. But the heat didn't fade. Behind the scenes, a producer whispered urgently into a headset. Something about trending hashtags. Something about blowback. Robert sat still, staring straight ahead. He hadn't come to be liked. He'd come to be heard. And for the first time in a long time, people were listening. The second segment wasn't supposed to feel like a trial. But as the cameras rolled back to life, Stephen Carr's smile had faded into something else, measured, rehearsed, a porcelain mask waiting to crack. The laughter in the room was thinner now. Some of the audience had leaned forward in their seats. Others had crossed their arms. But no one had left. No one could look away. Robert Reich sat quietly, his hands folded in front of him. A strange calm radiated from him, like the eye of a storm, waiting. Stephen tried to regain control. We're back with Robert Reich, author, economist, public agitator. That earned a few chuckles, but Robert didn't blink. Stephen exhaled and tried again. Let's talk specifics. You mentioned the Medicaid cuts. You called them immoral. But let's be honest, Robert, every administration has made cuts somewhere. What makes this different? Robert didn't answer immediately. Instead, he let the question hang in the air like smoke. Then, he spoke, quietly, but with surgical precision. It's not that the cut happened, he said. It's why it happened. This wasn't fiscal responsibility. This was ideological cruelty. You don't take $1 trillion out of Medicaid and give it to the rich by accident. You do it because you believe some lives matter less. A stunned silence followed. Stephen blinked. That's a strong accusation. It's a strong reality, Robert shot back. The administration didn't even bother justifying it. There was no theory, no Laffer curve, no rising tide nonsense. It was just, we want to do it. That's not policy, that's pillaging. The air in the studio changed. One of the producers could be seen pacing just off stage, headset buzzing with damage control. The camera operator briefly zoomed in on Stephen's face, a flash of discomfort. But Robert wasn't done. And you know what the most damning part is? He continued, voice sharpening. They didn't lie well. They didn't even try. Because they didn't think they had to. Stephen sat up straighter. All right, but hold on. Are you suggesting the current administration is deliberately trying to increase inequality? I'm saying they see it as a feature, not a flaw, Robert replied. Inequality keeps the angry distracted and the rich protected. It's a firewall. A buffer zone. And they're reinforcing it brick by brick. That's cynical, Stephen muttered, almost to himself. That's America, Robert snapped. Now the audience murmured again. Some clapped. A few booed. But even the dissent felt different, charged, as if something had been let out of the bottle. Stephen tried to pivot. You've said before we are in a second Gilded Age. That sounds ominous. But wasn't the first Gilded Age followed by the Progressive Era? Doesn't that mean there's hope? Robert nodded. Yes. That's what gives me strength. After the robber barons came the trustbusters. After monopolies came reforms. But the question isn't whether history repeats, it's whether we still have the will to respond. But, Stephen started. And whether the people still trust reform over revolution, Robert cut in. The words were heavy. Heavier than the room was ready for. Stephen swallowed. Are you saying revolution is on the table? I'm saying people are already in pain, Robert replied. When the rent rises and the wages don't, that's a powder keg. When the medicine costs more than your paycheck, that's a spark. And when leaders respond to that suffering with indifference or contempt, that's the match. He leaned forward again. Do you think this ends peacefully if nothing changes? Stephen's mouth opened, but no words came out. Robert sat back. I don't want chaos, he said. But I'm not naive enough to pretend it can't happen. The silence that followed wasn't just dramatic, it was frightening. Not a single cough. Not a whisper. Just that gnawing, crawling quiet that descends when people realize they might already be inside the thing they were afraid of. Stephen finally spoke, but his voice had lost its swagger. I've known you a long time, Robert. I've always respected your mind, even when I disagreed with you. But you're painting a picture that's borderline apocalyptic. Are we really that close to collapse? Robert turned to him slowly. Collapse doesn't always look like rubble. Sometimes it looks like indifference. Like apathy. Like letting the wrong people decide who gets to eat and who gets evicted. Stephen's fingers tapped nervously on his desk. All right. So what's the fix? What's the actual plan? Robert hesitated, just for a beat. And that hesitation felt human. Vulnerable. We start by admitting we're complicit, he said. All of us. You. Me. Every voter who checked out. Every journalist who played nice with power. Every citizen who chose comfort over confrontation. Stephen's jaw clenched. That's a lot of blame. It's not blame, Robert said. It's responsibility. And then something happened. Stephen broke. Not dramatically, not with tears or shouting, but in a way that was more dangerous, subtly, quietly. His voice got colder. More clipped. His posture changed, defensive. You know, he said, you come on this show with your lectures and your warnings, but you haven't run for office in 20 years. You haven't passed legislation. You haven't built a coalition. It's easy to sit in a tenured chair and scold everyone. The audience tensed. Robert didn't flinch. You're right, he said. I'm not in power. I'm not on the ballot. But I don't need a title to tell the truth. Stephen laughed, but there was no humor in it. Is it truth? Or just fear wrapped in idealism? Robert tilted his head. Is that what you tell yourself at night? That if you stay neutral long enough, history will forgive you? That landed like a slap. Stephen's face hardened. And then, quietly, bitterly, you think you're the only one who sees what's happening? You think you're brave because you get applause for saying what half the country already tweets. Now Robert flinched, just slightly. Stephen leaned forward. You want to burn it down because you think the ashes will grow something better. But what if they don't? What if they just choke the air? Robert responded in a whisper. Then we die knowing we tried to breathe. The audience was still. The crew was frozen. No one expected this. Certainly not the network. Stephen sat back in his chair, a flicker of regret crossing his face, but it was too late. The mask had cracked, and the anger had spilled. We have to take a break, he muttered. When we come back. No, Robert said, calmly. Don't cut away. Don't hide the truth behind a commercial for toothpaste. Let them see this. Stephen hesitated. The director in the booth signaled frantically. But Robert looked into the camera again. I don't want to scare you, he said. But if you're not scared, you're not paying attention. The lie isn't that everything's fine. The lie is that we can wait. And then. They're not coming to save us. We're it. Cut. The screen went black. Just for a moment. Then the logo returned, and the band played a weak riff to fill the silence. Backstage, the phones were ringing. Comment threads exploded. Trending hashtags crawled across news tickers before the segment even ended. The network was in panic mode. But for the viewers, something had shifted. The line between commentary and crisis had dissolved. This wasn't satire. It wasn't performance. It was prophecy. And people were starting to believe it. The commercial break was supposed to cool things down. It didn't. Backstage, the energy was chaos wrapped in whispers. Producers barked into headsets. Legal advisors hovered. The executive producer ran down a list of acceptable pivots, while an intern quietly deleted scheduled tweets. Robert Reich sat alone in his dressing room, staring into a mirror that seemed to mock him. The face looking back wasn't angry. It wasn't even tired. It was resolved. Like a man who knew exactly what storm he'd just walked into, and had done it on purpose. The knock on the door wasn't gentle. It was Stephen. No cameras. No mics. Just two men who had spent their lives in public, now face to face in a very private reckoning. You ambushed me, Stephen said, shutting the door behind him. Robert didn't look up. No. I answered you. You just didn't like the answer. Stephen's jaw tensed. You came here with an agenda. I came here with a warning. For who? Stephen snapped. The people? Or yourself? You keep preaching collapse, but maybe you're just mad no one's listening to you anymore. Robert stood. And for the first time tonight, he raised his voice. No one is listening because people like you keep putting them to sleep with jokes and neutrality. Stephen took a step forward. Don't lecture me. You had power. You had platforms. You had decades. What did you do with them, Robert? Wrote books? Taught theory? You're a prophet who showed up after the flood. Robert's eyes narrowed. At least I showed up. Silence. You think I enjoy this? Robert continued. You think I want to be the guy yelling fire while everyone else is lighting cigars? I spent 40 years hoping we'd prove ourselves better than this. But we didn't. And you sat at the center of it all and made it entertaining. Stephen's hands curled into fists. And what would you have me do? Preach? Lecture? Cry on air? Yes, Robert said. If that's what it takes. The room fell still. For a long time, neither man spoke. And then Stephen sat down, slowly, like the weight of something unseen had finally caught up to him. You know, he muttered, there was a time I thought we were doing good here. That if we made people laugh, they'd think. That if we slipped the truth in between punchlines, it would get through. It worked, Robert said quietly. Until it didn't. Stephen looked up. Then what now? Robert turned to the mirror again. We stop entertaining. We start unsettling. Stephen shook his head. That's not what they want. Robert looked him dead in the eye. It's what they need. Back on set, the third segment was supposed to be lighter. A story about a viral dog who could skateboard and sneeze on command. That segment was cut. The executive producer pulled every safety lever possible, delay the live feed, swap in pre-recorded applause, redirect the teleprompter. None of it worked. Because when the lights came back up and Robert Reich reappeared on stage, the audience sensed something had changed. Stephen followed a moment later, his smile gone completely now. He didn't bother with the usual quip or sponsor message. He simply looked at Robert, and then the camera. And then he said, "Let's finish this." Robert nodded. Stephen turned to the audience. We've had a conversation tonight that I didn't expect. And maybe that's good. Maybe we've gotten too good at managing expectations. Robert stepped in. Too good at pretending we're not drowning. Stephen continued. If you're watching this and thinking, this feels different, you're right. It is. Because we're not going to pretend anymore. Now the producers were panicking. The network cut the delay buffer from 7 seconds to 3. Then 2. Then 1. Robert leaned into the mic, addressing the nation directly. Don't wait for permission to be outraged, he said. Don't wait for perfect words to say enough. Say it now. Say it messy. Say it angry. Say it together. A woman in the audience stood and shouted, "We're with you." The crowd started clapping. Not polite applause, thunder. Someone chanted his name. Others followed. It wasn't rehearsed. It was raw. Stephen looked down at his hands. What have we been doing all this time? He whispered. Robert turned to him, gently now. What we thought we had to. But it wasn't enough. No, Robert said. But it's not too late. Stephen stared at the camera again. If this show gets pulled tomorrow, if I lose everything, I want you to remember this moment. I want you to ask yourself why. Behind the scenes, someone cut the feed. The screen went dark across thousands of living rooms. But the clips were already out. Viewers had started screen recording minutes before. Social media was on fire. The hashtags #enough and #RichSaidIt were already trending globally. And then the bootleg clip surfaced, the one filmed by a crew member's phone, capturing what the official broadcast didn't. The moment Robert Reich leaned in, one last time, and said, "They told us the revolution would be televised. They didn't say it would get cancelled halfway through." A beat. Then he smiled, a tired, weathered smile. And added, "But that's okay. We'll stream the rest ourselves." The truth didn't die in silence. It walked into a studio, stared down the system, and dared it to blink. If you made it this far, it means you're awake. Stay that way. Subscribe. We're just getting started.